Good morning, everyone. Should clap yourselves on the back because you actually made it here to the morning of, thank you, you did there, Hardy, I appreciate that. You made it here to the final day of Code4Lib, and you're still standing, or sitting, as it were. So those of you who've heard me attempt to sing should fall on your knees and pray that I'm not going to try to sing you into this conference. And thankfully, even before you begin to pray, your prayers have been answered. Because Becky Hughes, who can't be here with us, kindly recorded a welcome, which I will now play for you. So you're welcome.
Good morning, good morning. It's time to wake up. It's a brand new day. Good morning to you. Hello, Code4Lib. Good morning on this last day. Have fun.
Awesome. Thank you, Becky. And we surely miss you. Now there will be an announcement from Ann Slaughter, who's the coordinator of the Community Service Volunteers.
Thanks, Ray. Hey, everyone. We have a reminder from the Community Support Squad that Code4Lib strives to create a welcoming and inclusive environment. Please bear this in mind in all interactions you have, whether they're in person or on Slack, Twitter, or in other discussions. We ask you to model the behavior that you want to see in this community. Thank you.
Thanks, Ann. So when Aaron Collier and Mark Mattienzo started putting together this conference proposal, we were looking around for what great citizen we could get to chair the local planning committee. So Eric Pettiplace stepped up and said, well, he'd be willing to be co-chair. And Eric, could you come up here, please? He'd be willing to be co-chair, and we luckily enough found someone else who agreed to be co-chair, who then promptly found another job outside the library world and disappeared. So Eric stepped up, took over with his quiet yet totally effective and efficient manner, and led us to the conference you saw today. And I want you to understand that we were small but mighty, but that also meant that not all of us could attend every meeting. So there were some meetings when it was only Eric and Concentra. So if there's one person who deserves recognition for creating this conference, making it what it is Eric. Thanks. So, yay. So being from Sonoma, I'm trying to figure out what to give him in appreciation. And of course, it's wine. It's got to be wine. So I dug through my tiny but interesting wine cellar and pulled out the best bottle I have, which is a 2013 St. Francis Cabernet from a renowned vineyard called Rockpile. And this recently went for over $200 on auction, so you could just go for the money. Okay. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
You could say a few more words if you want. Okay. Thank you, Eric. Wouldn't be here without you.
Does anyone have a corkscrew?
Partay, wake and bake. Yeah. Last time I checked, you must be from Sonoma too. Last time I checked, there were still a couple slots for lightning talks, so if you're feeling inspired, please duck out and get your name on that list before they come up. Also, the guest elevators are being serviced between 1 and 3. The service elevators will still be available if you need them. The community support volunteers for the morning are Sean Ellis and Mark Mattienzo. They're located in the back of the room. You know they have zebra stripe lanyards, The online community support volunteers, Megan Kudzia, MKUDZIA on Slack. We would like to thank our contribute sponsors, the University of Miami Libraries, Unicon, UC Berkeley Library, University of North Texas, University Libraries, San Jose State University, and the Rockefeller Archive Center. Now I'd like to introduce our closing keynote speaker. Tarah Robertson is an intersectional feminist who uses data and research to advocate for equality and inclusion. She has more than 10 years' experience making open source and tech communities more diverse and welcoming. Her core values are social justice, collaboration, and all things open: open source, open access, and open education. Please join me in welcoming Tarah Robertson.
And thanks to the AV team who installed Firefox for me. I really appreciate it. I want to acknowledge that we're on the territory of the Tami and Ohlone people. My research and daily work are about power dynamics, and for me it's important to acknowledge some of the fundamental truths of colonization, land theft, and indigenous resilience. I'm so excited and a little nervous to be here. Most of my favorite people in libraries are in this room. Such an honor to be invited to give this talk. So writing titles is not a strength of mine. I'm mostly going to talk about my work around diversity and inclusion at Mozilla, and I'm going to take some detours and kind of blah, blah, blah. I put together a doc that has all the links that I'm going to reference, and they're here. And I'm one of those annoying extroverts who needs to think out loud. I really appreciate the generosity of all of these people. They're my friends, colleagues, comrades, librarians, sex worker activists, academics, archivists, feminists, queers, and artists. I want to acknowledge these people up front and thank them as a form of extended feminist citation practice. So I was born in a town called Prince George. I was born in Vancouver, but grew up in a town called Prince George, which is 10 hours north of Vancouver. It's the biggest town for 10 hours in any drive in any direction. So there's no McDonald's except for Prince George, and Prince George has 4. When I was a kid, we would measure the size of towns by the number of McDonald's. This is Mr. PG, the town mascot. 8 meters tall, originally made of wood. He rotted, and the replacement is built out of fiberglass and sheet metal to last. My mom is Japanese-Canadian, and my dad is white, of Scottish and Irish ancestry. I've lived in 7 different countries, including Scotland and Japan, partly to learn about the world, but I think I was also looking for a sense of where home is. Being mixed race and queer means that I don't fit in a lot of situations, and I don't belong. And this has given me a first-hand, really useful look at group dynamics, and I think I see things that some people don't. Before coming to Mozilla, I was a librarian for 12 years, mostly working in post-secondary institutions. People often ask about my strange career path from libraries to diversity and inclusion in tech, and I was active in this community and the Access community in Canada to make our conferences safer and more inclusive. And it's awesome to see how Code4Lib keeps iterating and getting better. I tweeted out a link earlier. If you have ideas on how we can keep making this community better, please add them there. For the last 5 years as a librarian, I managed an accessibility organization that serves students with print disabilities, and I'm still really passionate about accessibility and universal design. A year and a half ago, I joined Mozilla's diversity and inclusion team, and as their diversity and inclusion strategic partner, I'm the data person on our team. I've been building our infrastructure so we can measure progress on key diversity and inclusion metrics. I partner with different organizations in Mozilla on specific strategies for cultural inclusion. And I've led company-wide initiatives on trans and non-binary inclusion and accessibility. These are 2 questions that have guided my work for the last 10 years. So in most social situations, I think it's always important to observe who's in the room, who's at the table, who speaks a lot, who has a lot of social capital, who feels welcome, and whose ideas are respected and centered by default. I think it's even more telling to notice who's missing, who's sitting on the margins, who doesn't feel welcome, and who has to fight to have their viewpoints heard and respected. So right now, I invite you to look around the room and answer these questions quietly for yourself. In the last year and a half, I've been trying to figure out the answers to these questions at Mozilla. So, show of hands, who here is familiar with Mozilla? Yay! Mozilla is actually a very small company. There's only 1,200 of us worldwide, and our superpower are 10,000 community volunteers. Our mission is to ensure that the internet is a global public resource, open and accessible to all. And the way we do this is through open source products like the Firefox web browser that give people more control over their lives online and shape the future of the internet for the public good. And if you're not using Firefox, I suggest you download it and give it a try. It's fast, and we don't do creepy things with your data. So the Mozilla Corporation has one shareholder, the nonprofit Mozilla Foundation. It's kind of a unique and weird structure. And the foundation does really awesome work on policy. They publish the Internet Health Report, host MozFest in London, and offer fellowships to 26 amazing technologists, activists, and scientists from more than 10 countries. So at the start of our D&I journey at Mozilla, we did a bunch of focus groups with Mozillians. Those are people who work at Mozilla or who are in our community. And we heard about many diversity dimensions in our findings, and they've shaped how we think about diversity. So diversity is all the different things that make us who we are. It's our specific, unique, beautiful mix of people. And in the top right-hand corner, there's MoCo and MoFo. MoCo is our internal shorthand for the Mozilla Corporation, and we call people who work for the foundation MoFos. So then what's inclusion? We believe that inclusion is getting our specific mix of people to work well together, to invite voices forward, to speak boldly and respectfully, and to listen intently. Inclusion is about how each one of us wants to be treated. So for groups that value innovation and new ideas, diversity is key. There's plenty of social science research on this. One of my favorite articles is from Dr. Catherine Phillips, Professor of Leadership and Ethics at Columbia Business School. Her article titled How Diversity Makes Us Smarter and Scientific American is one of my favorite accessible summaries of the research. So Dr. Phillips says that diverse groups tend to outperform homogeneous ones. When we're around people who are just like us, whether it's people who are the same race, gender, or have the same political viewpoints as us, we tend to think we all hold the same views and have the same perspective. So when we hear dissent from someone who looks different from us, it provokes us more than when it comes from someone who looks like us. Diversity jolts us into cognitive action in ways that homogeneity does not. Simply by being in the presence of people who are not like you, you will be more diligent and open-minded. You will work harder at explaining your rationale and anticipating alternatives that you wouldn't have otherwise. And there's a couple of other important points in Dr. Phillips' article. While diverse groups performed better than homogeneous ones, they also had more conflict and enjoyed working together less. So as someone who works now, in D&I, this means that there's some additional training bits that need to happen. We need to build people's skills on giving and receiving feedback and communicating when there's conflict. So if Mozilla's mission is to ensure the internet is a global public resource, open and accessible for all, how are we going to build that if we don't have everyone at the table? And we don't just need everyone at the table. People need to feel free to bring their difference, and that will be valued and accepted. That's the inclusion piece. So being explicit about how we work together, both the behaviors that we want to see and those that we don't tolerate, is foundational for inclusion at Mozilla. This quote is from Mitchell Baker, our chairwoman. She says, Mozilla's mission is to build the internet as a global public resource, open and accessible to all. Open and accessible to all implies a deep commitment to inclusion and building inclusive practices. And as part of this commitment, we describe a set of behaviors of inclusion that we aspire to. And these are set out in our community participation guidelines. So our CPG is our code of conduct at Mozilla. And it outlines both behaviors we want to see and behaviors that are unacceptable. One of the required behaviors is be direct but professional. And this is just a quote from our CPG. We're likely to have some discussions about if and when criticism is respectful and when it's not. And we must be able to speak directly when we disagree and when we think we need to improve. We cannot withhold hard truths. Doing so respectfully is hard. Doing so when others don't seem to be listening is harder. And hearing such comments when one is the recipient can be harder still. But we need to be honest and direct as well as respectful. And I love that this is written in plain English, and recently I found myself dragging my feet on having a hard conversation that I needed to have with someone I care about at work. And as I was rehearsing this, I heard myself saying in my own voice, "We cannot withhold hard truths." And I was like, okay. And this was the nudge that I needed to hold myself to the standard to have this hard conversation. The CPG also outlines behaviors that are not tolerated, and these include violence, threats of violence, personal attacks, derogatory language, disruptive behavior like heckling speakers, and unwanted sexual attention or physical contact. And this is another quote, and I love how direct and how many concrete examples there are. So this includes touching a person without permission, including sensitive areas such as their hair, pregnant stomach, mobility device, or tattoos. This includes physically blocking or intimidating another person, physical contact or simulated physical contact with emojis like kiss without affirmative consent are not acceptable. And I think about these things a lot, and I hadn't thought about the emoji example, so for me, hearing that and seeing that called out explicitly is okay, so even when we're interacting with each other online, consent is important. Our CPG also includes the mechanism to report and information about the consequences of unacceptable behaviors. It's open license, so feel free to use it. And I think all the work that we do has a ripple effect in the world. And the CPG was used by Mozillians in Brazil at a JavaScript conference to call out some transphobic behavior that happened on stage. And the SQLite community recently adopted it. So I think these are positive ripples that we're making. So at Mozilla, we've been examining our hiring process, learning more about unconscious bias, and leveraging these learnings to hire the best people. And we've been inspired by the work that happened in orchestras. So in the 1970s, top orchestras in the US were only 5% women. At that time, there were lots of reasons given for this, including women have smaller techniques than men, women are more temperamental and likely to demand special attention or treatment, or the more women, the poorer the sound. And one conductor said bluntly, "I just don't think women should be in orchestras." It's okay. So by 2000, orchestras were almost up to 30% women. The main driver for this change was the introduction of blind auditions, where the musicians literally auditioned behind a curtain, so the panel couldn't see them. They were only assessing the candidates based on how they sounded. And they found even with the curtain, there were certain telltale signs like the click-clack of high heels, so they needed to debias further. And this included getting women with high heels to take their shoes off and walk while a man had shoes and went clomp, clomp, clomp. Now most US orchestras are 40 to 50% women, and though there are very few women who are conductors or who play in the brass section. And I read about this as the brass ceiling. So at Mozilla, our version of the blind audition is a tool called HackerRank. It's got an unfortunate name, but it enables our hiring managers to evaluate candidates based on the quality of their code, not their name, the perceived gender or race from that name, or the university that they graduated from. So we've been experimenting with HackerRank. It started with our university recruitment team and in our intern pool, and we've seen a huge, measurable increase in diversity of our candidates, or of our interns, rather. So over 4 years, the intern cohort shifted from 6 to 43% women. The biggest change in diversity was the number of colleges. So we only had interns from 7 colleges, and I'm sure you can probably make a pretty good educated guess of which ones those were. And now we have interns from 41 colleges, including a code academy. So smart, talented people don't come from specific universities. They can come from anywhere. And the overall diversity, we're up to 75% of the cohort either are women or people of color. So in an article in Wired titled "Diversity in Open Source is Even Worse Than Tech Overall," Clint Finley writes, "The open source development community remains startlingly white and male, even by the tech industry's dismal standards." I had a lot of imposter syndrome when I applied for this job at Mozilla. I was a librarian working at a college that no one's ever heard of in Canada, and I thought, they're not going to hire me. People like me don't work in the tech industry. Who do you think you are, was like this little imposter voice in my head. And there were 3 sentences in the job posting that made me apply. One was, you demonstrate a history of working in a collaborative and open manner, whether that be open source projects or simply openly discussing projects and questions. You should apply even though you don't feel your credentials are 100% match with the position description. And we're looking for relevant skills and experience, not a checklist that matches the position itself. So I just invite you to think about some of the job postings that we put out in libraries that are 2 pages long and have 47 bullet points. So the wording in the job posting, of course, it was by design. Knowing that open source skews white and male, requiring open source experience would limit the people who would choose to apply. And likely some excellent candidates would self-select out. The key experience here is open collaboration, not open source experience. So we use a tool called Textio to make sure our job postings use balanced language. Thankfully, we don't post ads for job ads for code ninjas or rockstar developers anymore. So how diverse are libraries? Who is missing? Who doesn't feel included? Librarianship is startlingly white as well. We know that librarianship is a profession that is predominantly female, but there's not much data about the racial makeup of librarians in Canada and the US. In Canada, there was only one study done, and they collected 1,700 names and email addresses from college and university websites. And from that, they got 900 responses. 91% of the respondents were white. You can see there's a footnote to the study if you want to see the data. And only 2% of respondents identified as Indigenous. According to the ALA Diversity Counts report in 2009-10, 88% of credentialed librarians in the US are white. According to ELISE, the Library and Information Science Education Statistical Report in 2015, 79% of students in ALA-accredited universities in the US are white. This means that our pipeline for future librarians is only slightly more diverse than the workforce now. It's problematic. So I think there's also the sparse or non-existent data tells a story about what's missing. We measure things we care about. And I hope that our library associations and researchers will take on this important work. We need to be able to better understand who's in libraries and understand the baseline so we can see change over time. I'm just going to pause for a second. So as a content warning, in the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about how institutions choose to uncritically adhere to standards in ways that are racist and violent. I'll be using racial slurs that refer to Japanese and Vietnamese people. But before I get into the hard examples, I want to introduce you to my grandparents. Eddie Kiyoshi Nakata and Sue Sueko Nakata. They use their English names, Eddie and Sue, to try and fit in. Growing up in Prince George, we would drive 10 hours to the Okanagan, the area of BC that's known for fruit and wine. They were farmers from the 40s, and they were able to buy their own small orchard in 1964. They mostly grew stone fruit like peaches, plums, cherries, and apricots. I reckon I get my love of early mornings, the comfort of daily routines, and my strong work ethic from them. They lived a frugal lifestyle and were very generous with their grandkids. After grade 8, my grandma left school and trained to be a seamstress. Until her 80s, she sewed most of her clothes from remnants. So when I mend someone's clothes with her sewing supplies, I honor her memory. Someone on social media tagged me on a post from Library and Archives Canada announcing a bunch of content from Japanese-Canadian internment that had been digitized by Landscapes of Injustice, a research project at the University of Victoria. And I'm not sure if most of you know that, similar to what happened in the US, Japanese Canadians were forcibly moved from the coast and interned by the government during World War II. In 1942, the Canadian government uprooted over 21,000 Japanese Canadians from coastal British Columbia, began the forced sale of their property and businesses to pay for their internment, and move them inland. This policy was not rooted in national safety, but in racism and fear. So in researching this talk, I actually learned my family wasn't interned because they were already living inland. So remember Dr. Phillips? She said, simply by being in the presence of someone who is not like you, you will be more diligent and open-minded. I want you to think of that as I go into this example. So here's one of the 180 photos that Landscapes of Injustice digitized. This lives in the digital collections of Library and Archives Canada. The title for this photo is, "On the coast, the TB rate amongst the Japs was fairly high, but moved to the drier atmosphere inland, and given a more varied diet, they are much healthier." So seeing the word Japs was a punch in the gut for me. And once I got over that, I noticed that the tone was pretty fucked up and told me more about the person taking the photo and how they view Japanese Canadians than the people in the photo. So internment wasn't a benevolent act done for the health of those people. And I hate how the passive voice, the Japs were moved, glosses over who moved them and why. I also noticed the typo. There's a distinct lack of diligence and open-mindedness here. And I'm also curious about the person who took the photo. Sorry, I'm curious about the people who are in the photo. Who are they? What were their stories? What did they do before they were interned? And did they take on English names like my grandparents? Who are these people's grandkids? Did they move back to the coast after internment? Do they also think that canned peaches taste like summer? I know that faithfully transcribing the words on the item is standard practice. However, this is an act of institutional violence and racism. We need to do better, and I want my National Library to do better. So when I'm outraged, I'm not the most eloquent or diplomatic. I quickly tweeted, "I'm happy that the photos of the Japanese Canadian internment were digitized, but what the actual fuck is this title?" I was impressed that the research project replied and said they'd look into it. I promised not to swear at them and use all caps. They actually came back to me, which I appreciated. Library and Archives Canada did not reply, and they took down the initial blog post. So linking back to the stats I shared about libraries being so white, I can't help but think that there were no Japanese Canadians involved anywhere in the digitization process. Throughout the process of digitizing this item, didn't anyone say, "Hey, this is messed up. Can't we do better?" So of course, this isn't the only example of standards causing harm. Mark Matienzo shared this tweet with me. Jade Alburo tweets, "Oh my God, attending a talk by Professor Long T. Bui about the Vietnam War and refugee memory. Apparently the biggest archive, that's not the National Archive, is the Vietnam Center and Archives at Texas Tech. When he tried to look for materials in their catalog on Vietnamese or South Vietnamese, he couldn't find anything. When he asked the librarian what's going on, he was told he had to use the term gooks. We all know that's a racist term, so why would an archive use this term? He was actually told that the archive is neutral, exclamation point. And we have to use the term or titles given to photographers or materials given by the donors, most of whom are American soldiers. So I know many librarians who buy into the myth that libraries and librarians are not neutral. This is one good example that isn't. This is still the tweet. You're centering a specific point of view and experience. By using a term only as the access point, you are preventing access to those materials by specific populations. So much like I would be flipping tables if I was required to use the keyword Japs as a search term to look for images of my family, I imagine that Vietnamese Americans would feel the same way. Jade Alburo makes an excellent point. Who is the user presumed to be, and whose worldview is left out? At last year's OpenCon, Stacey Allison Casson addresses this in her talk on Indigenous knowledge and infrastructure in the open. She says that because colonial terminology is so integrated into the systems and platforms we use, it can go unnoticed by most. But it's vitally important to stop referring to people with names they do not call themselves. While I shared examples of racist slurs against Japanese Canadians and Vietnamese people, I know that libraries and archives do this a lot to Black and Indigenous people too. Here are 3 amazing Indigenous knowledge workers and thought leaders who inspire me. Last November, I was invited to Keynote, the National Digital Forum in New Zealand, and learned so much from the people who are doing good work in Aotearoa. I recommend you listen to the recordings of these keynotes. Professor Kukatai specializes in Maori and Indigenous demographic research and is a founding member of the Maori Data Sovereignty Network. Sean Angeles Panange is the men's collection researcher at the Strello Research Centre in Alice Springs, Australia. He manages a highly restricted collection of Central Australian Aboriginal men's cultural heritage artifacts consisting of archival documents, genealogies, and a digitized catalog of ceremonial film and song recordings. Tua is a professional storyteller who shared her wisdom on collecting, preserving, and accessing cultural heritage collections in culturally appropriate and ethical ways. They're all total badasses. I learned so much. So on January 21st, which is MLK Day here in the US, Jessamine West tweeted, "There's something wrong at the Library of Congress. This tweet should have never happened. Librarianship has a whiteness problem." And hashtag MLK Day, and she's linking to the Library of Congress account, which tweeted, "Today in history, Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson was born." I'm like, the Confederate Army, that was the side that was fighting for slavery, right? Okay. So like, how do you send both of these tweets out on MLK Day? It became obvious to me that the tweets were either scheduled, and I'm assuming no one was monitoring the Twitter account. So much like the racist Gucci sweater and Katy Perry's blackface-inspired shoes, I wonder how diverse Library of Congress's social media and digitization team are. And if there are people of color there, do their colleagues listen to them when they raise legitimate concerns about bad decisions? And it's not just in our collections. This exclusion and violence takes place in our gatherings too. It shows up as racist microaggressions in the workplace, and it also looks like an ALA counselor, who is a white man, verbally assaulting our colleague April Cathcock, who is a Black woman, and also a member of ALA Council, in front of the council forum. None of the people present said or did anything to intervene. Librarianship is hostile to people of color. Our profession needs to do better, and it can't be on people of color to fix this. Our actual standards on acceptable behavior aren't what's outlined in our code of conducts, but rather it's the shitty behavior that we're willing to put up with without doing anything. That's actually where we're setting the bar. So I want to take a couple of seconds and invite you to think about what you would do if you witnessed something like this. So one of my colleagues says, "We don't say things like that around here," or "That's not okay, you need to stop." And I think these are both excellent responses for the many uncomfortable situations where you see racist, sexist, transphobic, or other oppressive behavior. So I want to link back to the key criteria for jobs and how we hire. And I think we need to interrogate our assumptions about what is necessary to be a librarian. So if we go back to the arguments around diversity and innovation, Working to make our workplaces more diverse is something that libraries must do to survive and be relevant. Also, there's additional arguments about reflecting the diversity of our user groups and society. Seeing the lack of racial diversity in library school student data, which is our pipeline, I think we need to rethink the degree requirement for all librarian jobs. And we need to articulate the core competencies of what's actually important in libraries now and broaden our view of whose qualifications are relevant. We need to recruit from a more diverse pool of candidates. And I'm not talking about lowering the bar, but rather being more critical about what we need, which actually might raise the bar. And please, we need to stop talking about cultural fit on our hiring committees. Culture fit is a shorthand for hiring people who look and think just like us. So we're perpetuating a monoculture. And this isn't what we need to be relevant now or in the future. In addition to rethinking our hiring pool, we need to build additional scaffolding so that people of color can imagine a future for themselves here in libraries, where the mentorship and promotion path is clear. Diversity and inclusion are intertwined, and we need to work to change the culture of libraries so that people of color can bring their full selves to work and that the difference is seen, appreciated, and valued. This will mean some hard and necessary conversations about our culture and whiteness. So I'm going to shift gears and talk about consent now. So in 2015, I proposed at this conference that we ask speakers for permission to live stream their talks. Hi, live stream. And that we use colored lanyards as a visual shorthand to communicate people's desire to be in photos online. Some of the initial comments from men in this community who'd been here longer than me really bummed me out. So some of them included, I enjoy taking candid photos of people at the conference and no one seems to mind. And my old hippie soul cringes at unnecessary paperwork. A consent form means nothing. Situations change. Even a well-intended argument sometimes needs to be reneged on. And I think people's views also change. So if I just called out something that you wrote many years ago, I know that your ideas could have shifted as well. So I was able to get enough support to get this off the ground. And shout out to Ranty, who helped me pull together the consent form and run around and get all the speakers. And thankfully, lots of things have changed, and this is just a default here now. And I think this is also a place where Code4Lib has shown leadership, and other conferences have followed suit. So consent is something that's really important to me as a feminist. I'm going to take a quick detour and share another personal story. In spring 2016, I came out in my professional life as a former sex worker at Code4Lib, New York State. And I want to thank Christina Harlow, Francis Kayua, and John Fink for their love, support, and friendship. They're the kind of friends who literally show up in the front row and hold space. So I surprised myself where I cry during these talks. I didn't think it was going to be there, but I think we're able to do courageous, awesome things because we have supportive people who love us, and we support each other. And that's one of the things that I think is so magical about this community. Okay. So I know what it's like to have content about myself appear online that I didn't consent to. In my case, it's a newspaper article in a major Canadian newspaper that identifies me as a sex worker and a librarian. For most of my career, I was terrified that my employer or colleagues would find this out. We live in a judgmental society where there are many negative stereotypes about sex workers. I was worried that this would undermine my professional reputation. I think that we would all agree that open access to information is a good thing. However, over the last couple of years, I've come to realize this isn't an absolute, and there are some times where it's not appropriate or ethical for information to be open to all. In 2016, I learned that Reveal Digital, a nonprofit that works with libraries, digitized On Our Backs, a lesbian porn magazine that ran from 1984 to 2004. First, I was really excited because it was porn that was nostalgic for me and I could see it online. And then I quickly thought about friends who appeared in this magazine before the internet existed. I was worried that this kind of exposure could be harmful to their personal and professional lives. And there's ethical issues with digitizing collections like this. Consenting to a porn shoot that's going to be in an indie print magazine is a very different thing than consenting to be in a porn shoot that's going to be on the internet forever. So for a year, I kept digging and researching this topic, and I found contributor contracts on Cornell's rare book and manuscripts collection. I learned more than I ever wanted to about US copyright law, and most importantly, I talked to queer women who modeled for On Our Backs to hear what they had to say. So this is a quote from one of the models in an email to me. She writes, "People can cut up my body and make it collage. My professional and personal life can be hijacked. These are uses I never intended and still don't want." So I was successful in getting this collection taken down from Reveal Digital's collection by publicly questioning the ethics of digitizations of projects like this and amplifying the voices of models. I learned, again from Mark Matienzo, that about 10 days ago, Reveal Digital is now part of, I think it's Ithaca, who owns JSTOR and ArtStore. So I've got a favor to ask all of you, especially those who work at large research universities. Can you keep an eye on these folks and what they're digitizing? And can you raise questions about the ethics of this? I think they're member funded, so your voices mean a lot here. I'm going to skip a bit more about some stuff we do at events at Mozilla, because I'm running out of time. Our all hands are something that happened twice a year. 40% of our company works remotely, so getting together in the same place is really important to build that connective tissue so we can work well together the rest of the year. So last summer, our all hands was in San Francisco, and just imagine maybe a hotel ballroom 3 times the size of this, with 1,200 people in there, and there's kind of music and lights. And in between the plenary session, where our executives present kind of the current and future strategy, regular staff were interspersed, reading thank you emails from our users and sharing short snippets. So this is who talked between the chief marketing officer and the chief people officer. Okay, I hope the sound comes through.
Hi, my name is Lauren Nylett. I work on lifecycle marketing out of my home in North Carolina. I recently sent a letter to Yasha, who you just met, and I'm going to share it with all of you now. Yasha, you might recall a conversation we briefly had at Austin All Hands about some interesting changes in my life. But just to put a label on it, I'm transitioning my gender presentation to female. This has been a lifelong time coming. Thank you. This has been a lifelong time coming. While I wouldn't say changing genders is anything close to the easiest thing I've ever done, this ongoing process has already been one of the best. I've been asking colleagues, 1 or 2 at a time, to start calling me Lauren and referring to me with feminine pronouns. And I'd like for you to do the same. Don't worry about slip-ups. I forget at least once a day, and it's my name. Like any self-respecting marketer, I'm working with HR on a go-to-market strategy to take this news big. That is, by the way, highfalutin talk for an email to all of marketing. But I'm writing to give you an early heads up. I do want to mention that your personal and professional commitment to making Mozilla marketing a safe space that values all people was a huge factor in my decision to begin transition. As a member of the group that worked on team norms, I'm very aware that things here weren't perfect. But I also know that after I began living authentically, I would feel respected and protected at Mozilla. and the work I do would be more important than my pronouns. You should know how much of an incredible impact your commitment to these values can have on one individual life. Thank you just doesn't seem to capture it. Thank you.
So Lauren moved me to tears, and I wasn't the only one in the audience who was crying. I have deep admiration for her courage. There was this amazing feeling in the room after the loud cheers, and when people realized what was actually going on, I could feel everyone sort of lean forward in their seats and give her their care and attention. I wrote guidelines to support staff who are transitioning their gender at work. And initially, I intended it to be a short checklist or list of places where you would need to update your name and gender markers. But it became more comprehensive to give context to the understanding of gender more broadly, for managers to understand their responsibilities, and for all staff to understand how they can make Mozilla a more welcoming and inclusive place. I heard from managers that they wanted to do the right thing and that they worried they might make a mistake and hurt someone. So I organized some training to help our staff level up their knowledge and comfort in being inclusive of trans and non-binary colleagues. So remember, we're only like 1,200 people, and 180 people came to this training. And the recordings have been viewed 300 times. Mozillians care, and they want to learn more and do better. Taking a stand on inclusion is not something we just do internally, but increasingly it's how we're showing up in the world. In the face of legislative and administrative attempts to further marginalize trans and non-binary people in the US, Mozilla publicly affirmed our commitment to diversity and inclusion by fostering a supportive work environment along with 55 other major companies. So there's postcards on the table. I think you're probably familiar with the term microaggression, but I want to introduce the idea of microinclusion. There's small ways that we can choose to show up in our daily work and life to make things a little more inclusive. So I want you to think of like one small bite-sized thing that you can actually do. So like overthrowing capitalism or smashing the patriarchy, not so bite-sized. And write your future self what your commitment is. So on the left side, I want you to write that small bite-sized thing. And on the right side, I want you to write your address properly so that the organizers can just throw it in the mail and it'll show up to you. So you've got a couple of minutes. Does anyone not have a postcard? Awesome. Oh, and if you're going to write something really personal or something you don't want to go through the mail or your colleagues to see, there's some envelopes at the registration desk. So I'll give you a couple minutes. So we're coming up on the break time. If you're not done writing, finished writing, you can drop your postcard at the registration table, and the event planners will send them out over the next little while. So it's not like you're going to get it in a week, but I hope that when this shows up, you'll remember Code4Lib and you'll remember how you want to show up in your workplace. I think we all have a role to play in culture, and I'm curious to learn how you want to show up. Thank you. I think we only have 3 seconds left.
Break at 10, so I think we've got, it's because we started
Oh, no, I think I'm going to hang out. So if you've got questions, come and talk to me or tweet at me. But thanks.
Thank you, Tarah. That was awesome, as always. Okay, we're going to go on our break now. I'll be back here at 10:15. And last time I looked, we had another slot or two lightning talks, so if there's a slot open, feel free to sign up for that. Also, if you've been up here on the podium or will be and haven't signed our consent form in light of Tarah's talk about getting consent or not getting consent, you can also say no on this. Please go to the reg desk and fill one of these out for us. And I realized that I hadn't done that, so I'm doing this right now. So thank you, and be back here at 10:15.